Final warning about what we often call the empath can completely reshape the way you understand your own kindness and sensitivity. For most people, sensitivity has been framed as something almost sacred, a spiritual advantage, a rare emotional gift, or a sign of being more evolved than others. But Jung invites a far more uncomfortable interpretation. What looks like a gift on the surface is often not origin story spirituality at all, but adaptation, a survival strategy shaped in environments where emotional safety was not guaranteed. In many cases, this heightened sensitivity didn't begin as a conscious choice. It began in childhood, in homes where emotional unpredictability forced you to become alert far beyond your years. You were not given the freedom to simply be a child, loud, messy, self-centered, or expressive. Instead, you learned quickly that harmony mattered more than authenticity. You discovered that keeping others calm, managing tension, and avoiding emotional disruption made life feel safer. Over time, you unconsciously adopted a role, the stabilizer, the listener, the one who senses shifts before they become conflicts. This is where Jung's perspective becomes unsettling. What you now call empathy may have originally formed as a form of emotional compliance, a way to stay secure in relationships where love or acceptance felt conditional. You didn't become attuned to others because you were spiritually advanced. You became attuned because your nervous system learned that other people's emotional states were unpredictable sources of threat or safety. As this pattern developed, something profound happened internally. Your attention slowly shifted outward. You became extremely skilled at detecting emotional changes in others, tone shifts, facial tension, silence that feels off, or energy that suddenly tightens in a room. But in the same process, your awareness of yourself began to fade into the background. You became fluent in everyone else's emotional language while gradually losing access to your own internal experience. Jung described this kind of adaptation as a psychological split, where the self is organized around external perception rather than internal identity. In simpler terms, you begin to exist as a reflection of others rather than as a fully grounded individual. You learn what others need from you, and you become that version. Over time, this creates a pattern of self-erasure where your identity is constantly adjusted based on the emotional environment around you. This is why the so-called empathic drive can feel both meaningful and exhausting at the same time. On one hand, it feels like compassion. On the other, it often leads to emotional depletion, confusion, and burnout. You are constantly scanning, adjusting, absorbing, and responding, often without realizing how little space remains for your own needs. What makes this pattern even more difficult to recognize is that it is often rewarded. People appreciate the empathic individual. They feel understood, seen, and emotionally supported. This reinforces the identity of being the strong one or the healing presence. But underneath that role is a quieter truth, a nervous system that has learned to prioritize everyone else's regulation over its own stability. From a psychological perspective, this is closely linked to hypervigilance. In childhood environments where emotional states were unpredictable, the brain adapts by becoming extremely sensitive to microsignals. This is not metaphorical, it is neurological conditioning. The brain learns to track subtle cues, shifts in tone, body language, silence, or emotional withdrawal. It becomes a constant monitoring system, always predicting what might happen next in order to avoid emotional disruption. Jung referred to this as a form of early ego adaptation, where the developing self organizes itself around external conditions rather than internal authenticity. The result is a mind that is highly intelligent about others, but underdeveloped in its relationship with the self. This creates what Jungian psychology often describes as a paradox. You can understand people deeply, anticipate their emotions, and even support them through complex internal states, yet still feel disconnected from your own desires, boundaries, and identity. It becomes easier to know what someone else is feeling than to answer a simple question like, "What do I actually feel right now?" At the core of this imbalance is something that many psychological traditions point to but rarely explain clearly: the suppression of healthy self-orientation. Every developing person needs a sense of internal importance, a grounded feeling of "I matter too." But in emotionally unstable environments, that natural development is often discouraged. Needs are labeled as burdens, expression is seen as disruption, and self-focus is treated as something unsafe or unacceptable. So instead, you adapt. You become outward focused. You become the problem solver, the emotional translator, the quiet stabilizer in other people's storms. You build an identity around understanding everyone else while unconsciously placing your own emotional world in storage. Over time, this can create a life that looks functional on the outside but feels internally disconnected. You may find yourself repeatedly exhausted, emotionally overextended, or quietly resentful, not because you lack compassion, but because your compassion has been operating without boundaries. Jung's perspective, however, is not meant to leave you in this realization as a place of limitation. Instead, it points toward transformation. He did not view this pattern as a flaw in character, but as an unfinished stage of psychological development. In his framework of individuation, a human being is not complete until they integrate both outward awareness and inward identity. You have likely already developed the outward half, the ability to sense, respond, and emotionally attune. The next stage is not to abandon empathy, but to bring it back home, to turn the same awareness you give others toward yourself, to begin recognizing your own emotional signals with the same precision you once reserved for everyone else. This is where real psychological integration begins, not by becoming less sensitive, but by becoming internally anchored. Not by shutting down compassion, but by removing the condition that says your worth depends on managing everyone else's emotional world. The exhaustion, the emotional overload, the feeling of being drained by relationships, these are not signs that your empathy is too strong. They are signs that it has been operating without return flow, and that imbalance is what eventually pushes a person toward change. In Jungian terms, this is the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming a whole, internally centered human being rather than a reactive reflection of others. It is not about losing your sensitivity. It is about reclaiming the part of you that was never given permission to exist fully in the first place. And that is where the real shift begins. These experiences are not evidence that something is wrong with you. They are signals from your psyche, indicating that you can no longer keep abandoning your authentic self just to maintain other people's comfort. What you've been carrying isn't simply empathy, it's the emotional weight of a constructed identity built in response to environments where your needs were secondary or even invisible. At a certain point, the journey shifts. You begin to recognize that what feels like being good to others has often come at the cost of being absent to yourself. This is where Jung's perspective becomes especially important because it reframes what looks like selflessness as something more complex, a pattern that once ensured survival but now limits growth. The next stage of development is what can be described as a form of reclaimed self-orientation, sometimes referred to as sacred selfishness. This is not selfishness in the distorted sense of disregard for others, but a deeper psychological correction. It is the realization that your first responsibility is not external approval, but internal development. From this point forward, empathy is no longer automatic or compulsive. It becomes conscious. You are no longer driven by emotional reflex. Instead, you begin to choose where your attention, energy, and care actually go. In Jungian terms, this is not regression, it is integration. It is the shift from being emotionally reactive to becoming internally anchored. Rather than constantly absorbing the emotional states of others, you begin to develop a boundary where experience belongs to you first before it is shared outward. What this ultimately produces is not emotional coldness, but psychological wholeness. You begin to build a structure within yourself, a kind of inner stability where sensitivity no longer overwhelms you. Instead of being exposed and unprotected, you develop what can be understood as psychological containment, the ability to feel deeply without being consumed by what you feel. A central concept in Carl Jung's work that explains this process is the shadow. The shadow is not a symbol of evil or corruption. It is the collection of parts of yourself that were disallowed, discouraged, or made unsafe during development. These are not negative traits by default, they are simply unintegrated aspects of your personality. For many people with strong empathic conditioning, this includes anger, assertiveness, self-interest, and the ability to say no without guilt. When a child is rewarded for being agreeable, helpful, or emotionally accommodating, they often learn to suppress these traits. Over time, the personality becomes one-sided. You develop a highly functional light self, kind, understanding, supportive, while the shadow self is pushed out of awareness. But what is suppressed does not disappear. It accumulates. This creates what Jung described as a compensatory imbalance within the psyche. The mind naturally seeks equilibrium when one side of the personality is overdeveloped, such as constant giving, accommodating, and emotional labor. The suppressed side does not remain silent. It builds pressure internally. That pressure often emerges as resentment, irritability, emotional fatigue, or a quiet sense of dissatisfaction that is difficult to explain. You may still appear composed on the surface, continuing to show up for others, offering understanding and support. But internally, something begins to shift. The emotional cost of constant self suppression starts to surface, not necessarily as open anger at others, but as a deeper exhaustion with the role you are playing in their lives. This is not a moral failure, it is a psychological correction mechanism. The psyche is attempting to restore balance by forcing awareness of what has been ignored. When this imbalance is prolonged, it often leads to what can be described as empathic burnout, a state of deep emotional depletion that cannot be resolved through rest alone. It is not simple fatigue, it is the collapse of a one-sided identity. From a Jungian lens, this state is not random breakdown. It is an individuation pressure point, a moment where the unconscious demands change. The helper identity that once provided meaning and safety begins to feel restrictive, even suffocating. What once felt like purpose now feels like obligation. At this stage, healing does not come from giving more. It comes from reintegration. The key is no longer to suppress the shadow, but to bring it into conscious awareness. This means recognizing that the parts of you that were rejected, especially anger and self-protection, are not destructive forces. They are signals. Anger in particular is often a boundary alarm. It appears when something important has been crossed or ignored for too long. Reclaiming these aspects does not make you less compassionate. It makes your compassion sustainable. The ability to say no without guilt, to recognize exhaustion without self-punishment, and to prioritize your own needs without justification is not regression. It is maturity in psychological terms. As integration deepens, something significant shifts. Giving no longer feels like depletion because it is no longer driven by compulsion. It becomes intentional. You are no longer offering yourself as an unlimited resource to be consumed. Instead, you are engaging with others from a grounded internal state where your own needs are acknowledged and protected. In this state, the resentment begins to dissolve, not because others change, but because the internal conflict is no longer active. You are no longer divided between what you give and what you suppress. The wounded healer dynamic begins to fade, replaced by a more integrated form of presence, one that is capable of both connection and self-preservation. This is the essence of Jung's deeper invitation. Not to abandon empathy, but to evolve it. Not to reject others, but to stop rejecting yourself. In reclaiming the disowned parts of your personality, you stop performing emotional survival and begin living from psychological wholeness. For years, you may have been conditioned to believe that prioritizing yourself is something negative, almost like a moral failure, emotional coldness, or a betrayal of others. But in Jungian psychology, that entire framing gets turned completely upside down. What is often labeled as selfishness is not a flaw at all when understood correctly. It can actually be the foundation of emotional sovereignty. Sacred selfishness is not about becoming detached, indifferent, or self-absorbed. It is about finally recognizing a truth that most people are never taught directly. You are responsible for your internal world, but you are not responsible for managing everyone else's. When that boundary is missing, life becomes an emotional overflow system where everything others feel, stress, frustration, unresolved pain, ends up entering your nervous system as if it belongs to you. Without sovereignty, you don't have a self-contained emotional space. You become an open channel, constantly absorbing what doesn't originate from you. Sacred selfishness is the act of closing that unguarded opening. It is the realization that care does not require absorption and love does not require self-erasure. You can be present for someone without becoming the container for their emotional weight. When this shift begins, it often changes your entire relational landscape. Jung pointed out that this stage of development is rarely comfortable for the surrounding environment. The moment you stop overfunctioning, stop fixing, overgiving, or emotionally overextending, people who benefited from that pattern will feel the difference. And often they will react to it. This reaction is not always malicious. Many people are simply accustomed to a version of you that carried more than their share. When that dynamic changes, discomfort naturally arises. Some may interpret your boundaries as rejection, emotional distance, or even selfishness. In reality, what they are responding to is the loss of access to an old version of you, the one who overextended themselves at their own expense. From a Jungian lens, this stage acts like a filter. Relationships begin to reorganize themselves based on authenticity rather than utility. Connections that depended on you being endlessly available, endlessly understanding, or endlessly accommodating tend to weaken. But relationships that are rooted in mutual respect and genuine connection often stabilize and deepen. For the first time, you are not functioning as a role. You are present as a whole person. This is where empathy itself begins to transform. What used to be automatic and overwhelming starts becoming intentional and selective. Instead of being emotionally pulled in every direction, you begin to experience choice. You are no longer governed by reflexive sensitivity. You develop awareness of when to engage, when to step back, and when to preserve your own energy. Jungian psychology describes this shift as a movement toward compassionate detachment, not emotional withdrawal, but emotional clarity. It is the ability to remain present with another person's experience without losing your own center in the process. You can care deeply without collapsing into what you care about. In this state, support becomes more effective, not less. You are no longer helping from depletion or emotional urgency. You are helping from stability. The difference is subtle but profound. One comes from the need to be needed, the other comes from a grounded sense of choice. One leads to burnout, the other leads to sustainability. This is where the metaphor of the lighthouse becomes useful. A lighthouse does not enter the storm. It does not drown in the sea to prove its care. It stands steady, offering direction precisely because it remains anchored. In the same way, emotional strength is not about disconnecting from others. It is about refusing to lose yourself in their turbulence. When this integration begins to settle, something important happens internally. Resentment starts to dissolve. Much of emotional exhaustion in empathic individuals does not come from caring itself, but from caring without boundaries. Once boundaries are in place, giving no longer feels like loss. It becomes a conscious act rather than an unconscious drain. At this stage, empathy stops functioning like a compulsion and starts functioning like a skill. You are no longer emotionally hijacked by other people's states. Instead, you can observe, respond, and choose. This is where sensitivity becomes strength rather than vulnerability. Jung's deeper insight here is that psychological wholeness is not achieved by eliminating sensitivity, but by grounding it in a stable sense of self. When empathy is rooted in insecurity, it becomes self-destructive. When it is rooted in inner stability, it becomes precise, discerning, and life-giving. This is also where the identity of the people pleaser begins to dissolve. That identity is not who you are. It is a strategy you developed in response to earlier environments. And like all survival strategies, it eventually reaches a point where it limits the very life it was designed to protect. What replaces it is not hardness, but integration. You remain sensitive, but no longer porous. You remain caring, but no longer self-erasing. You remain open, but no longer unprotected. From this perspective, service to others is completely redefined. Helping is no longer an act of depletion or sacrifice. It becomes an expression of overflow. When your internal world is no longer in deficit, your giving no longer carries hidden emotional cost. There is no resentment underneath it, no silent exhaustion attached to it, and no unconscious expectation of repayment. This is the difference between giving from survival and giving from wholeness. One is driven by internal emptiness, the other is guided by internal sufficiency. One leaves you drained, the other leaves you steady. In Jungian terms, this is part of the individuation process, the movement toward becoming a fully realized human being. Not a role, not a function, not an emotional caretaker for others, but a complete self that can relate to the world without self-abandonment. As this integration deepens, your sensitivity does not disappear. It becomes refined. You begin to perceive more clearly, not less. You notice emotional undercurrents, unspoken tensions, and subtle dynamics, but without losing your center in the process. You are no longer absorbed by what you perceive. You are grounded within it. And that changes your presence entirely. You are no longer someone who disappears into others. You become someone who can stand beside others without losing yourself. That stability alone can be transformative for the people around you because it demonstrates something they may not have experienced before: care without collapse. In the end, the real shift is not about becoming less emotional. It is about becoming emotionally sovereign. You are no longer living as a reaction to others. You are living as a defined, contained, and conscious self. And from that place, empathy is no longer a burden. It becomes something much rarer, a choice. If there is one line that captures the essence of this transformation, it is this: you are no longer available to life at the cost of yourself. You are available to life from the strength of yourself. In conclusion, Jungian psychology reveals that what you once saw as pure empathy is often a survival pattern shaped by early emotional conditioning. The real transformation begins when you move from compulsive self-sacrifice into emotional sovereignty, learning that you are responsible for your inner world, but not for carrying everyone else's. Through the integration of the shadow and the practice of sacred selfishness, you stop abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable. Boundaries replace burnout, awareness replaces overwhelm, and empathy becomes conscious rather than automatic. You no longer give from emptiness, but from inner stability and overflow. Ultimately, this journey is not about becoming less caring. It is about becoming whole. You remain sensitive, but no longer self-erasing. Grounded in your own identity, your empathy becomes a strength rather than a wound, allowing you to connect deeply with others without losing yourself in the process.